In this video I will look into Spain's international situation right after World War II with the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945. At the time, Francisco Franco was the dictator of Spain, after gaining power during the Spanish Civil War with the help of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. During the Second World War and with the initial victories of the Axis powers, let's say that Spain underwent a transformation towards fascism. However, with the end of the war and the defeat of Italy and Germany, Franco lost its only allies and had to confront a very difficult international situation. First, I will go through Spain's downward spiral into isolation, and later I will look into how Franco was able to overcome this situation. First of all, I will look into how Spain was isolated in the international stage right after World War II. The first step was taken during the Potsdam Conference in 1945, where the leaders of the USSR, the US, and the UK met to discuss the post-war world order and decided that Spain wouldn't be allowed to enter the United Nations, a new organization that they planned to create to maintain world peace. Also, once the UN was established that same year, the organization itself decided to ban Spain from entering and made a joint declaration denouncing the Francoist regime. This declaration also meant that the members of the organization would eventually remove their ambassadors from Spain, which completely isolated Spain from the rest of the world. Also, due to the regime's international isolation, the Spanish opposition decided to intensify. The communists decided to increase the activity of the guerrilla, and they also organized an army of 6,000 men that fought alongside the Allied armies during the liberation of France and the occupation of Germany to invade Spain from the French border. On the other hand, various sectors of the army, the church, and the aristocracy launched a campaign of backdoor diplomacy to restore the monarchy and end with Spain's international isolation. In fact, 8 of the 12 generals in the general staff signed a letter where they asked Franco to resign. Therefore, it could be argued that Franco was in a very dire situation. In the face of this international isolation, Franco decided to move away from fascism and brand himself as a military and Catholic leader with anti-communistic views that fought to preserve Western principles. In order to do this, he removed all fascist symbols, replaced fascist ministers with army generals and representatives of the church, and even restored the monarchy, although nobody would be crowned until his death. These changes replaced fascism and gave birth to a new form of government that would later be recognized as National Catholicism. However, this didn't bring any immediate change in the international stage. Not at least until 2 years later, in 1947, when the Cold War began to settle and Franco's anti-communistic views really began to appeal the Western powers. Therefore, they decided to forget about their old rivalry for the sake of adding an important ally to their cause. In fact, Spain controlled the entrance to the Mediterranean, which was key for the Western powers. In consequence, France reopened its border with Spain in 1947, and the US government allowed Spain to acquire an American loan for the first time that same year. 3 years later, in 1950, the UN decided to reverse its previous declaration denouncing the Francoist regime and invited Spain to participate in various organizations related to the UN. This also meant that most members would eventually send their ambassadors back to Madrid. After this, Spain was more integrated in the Western Bloc, and in the following years, Franco would take the final steps to become fully integrated. In 1953, Spain signed a concordat with the Pope in Rome that established Franco's image as a Catholic leader. Also, Spain signed the Madrid Agreement with the US that same year, which allowed the US to build 4 military bases in Spanish soil in exchange of economic aid. And finally, in 1955, Spain became a full member of the United Nations. The new international stage led to a decrease in the activity of the opposition and allowed Franco to overcome the deepest of crises that he had to endure in his 40 years of rule. To conclude, Spain entered a downward spiral of international isolation right after World War II due to the help that Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy gave to Franco during the Spanish Civil War and Spain's affiliations with the Axis powers during the course of the Second World War. In the face of this international isolation, the Spanish opposition decided to increase its activity, either through guerrilla fighting or backdoor diplomacy. Therefore, Franco decided to rebrand his regime and move away from fascism and center his new form of government around the army and the church, a form of government that would later be known as National Catholicism. However, this didn't change the international perception of the Francoist regime until the idea of the Cold War settled amongst the Western powers, and they began to see Spain as a possible ally instead of an old enemy.